joining us today, and we're going to talk about a topic that I have noticed is getting a lot of press coverage, and people have different ways of talking about it, but I think everybody has a similar, heart and goal for kids. And I know our funders have been working all through the pandemic on ensuring, especially at the beginning, access to technology, like trying to prevent gaps growing and disparities between kids. And it went on much longer than we expected. And now it's time to start thinking about how we're going to welcome children back into classrooms with equity next year, and what we might do over the summer. And, because I know that we are very privileged to have local, state, and national funders in our group. People are being asked at all different levels to support different projects to try to address this issue. And so we thought it was a great time to gather. Really, I can't say enough about the amazing panel that we have to talk to us about this. So it's our great privilege to have them. So we will keep this very informal. What I will do is I will briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'm just going to ask some questions and they'll have a chance to respond. And a couple people submitted questions in advance. And Rena and I will also watch the chat, so that after I ask a few, if something comes up that is really burning for you and you want to ask it, we'll try to work that in as well. So we're very excited to have with us today Ralph Smith from the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Dr. Chantal Meek from the Children's Equity Project, Dr. Devanya Govan Hunt, who is the Charlotte chapter president of NBCDI, and that's my hometown, gotta say it. Seema Ray James, who is the interim executive director of the National Black Child Development Institute, and Dr. Rosemary Allen, who's an associate professor in education at Metropolitan State University in Denver, and is also the CEO of the Institute for Racial Equity and Excellence. I think I got everybody. So this is just an amazing all-star panel. So I want to start out by just setting the table a little bit about what we're talking about and giving you guys a chance to tell us which are the things that are worrying you. So the way I'm thinking about this is there's been a lot of news coverage about learning loss, but I just saw a study saying, wait, there's some data out saying it's not as bad as we thought. And like everything in this pandemic, it's a little hard to know what is trying to think ahead, project what might be happening so that we can get ahead of issues, versus where we have some hard data showing us kind of what is happening. So my first question is, what do we know about learning loss and about the status of kids learning during this pandemic year and where they're coming back? What do we know? And if you don't think we know very much, what information are you acting on? What are you thinking about? And I'm watching, you guys can wave or just start, either way. Maybe I'll call on Chantal. How's that? Chantal, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, Shannon. Hi, everyone. Happy to be with you all today. What do we worry about? And I invite everyone else to jump in here. I mean, I think I spend a lot of time thinking about discipline, and we do a lot of work in bias and discipline. So when I think about the transition back and how it is a period of stress and increased stress for kids, for families, for providers, across all of the domains of life, across finances, across housing, across food, across health, and employment, I worry about that, right? Because how do little kids express emotions and communicate, right? And a lot of times it's through behavior that adults see as challenging, especially a lot of kids who have been out of routine for a long time, a lot of kids who have been through trauma, perhaps a lot of kids who have faced increased stress. And so I think that paired with how stress and anxiety can make you more prone to implicit bias or to act on those biases. And kind of the combination of those two things and how we already see pretty stark disparities, consistently stark disparities in discipline and how that may intensify if we are not taking kind of this trauma informed approach, and this approach that like we've all been through a lot, especially our youngest children, right? And we should expect a transitionary period. And so if we're not supporting the workforce, both with how to manage that and how to support kids' positive mental health and social emotional development, but also understanding bias, and understanding how it manifests and understanding how it influences how we perceive behaviors and then the decisions we make based on those perceptions. That's one specific thing that I think about a lot. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about focusing on mental health and focusing on the social emotional, and I am definitely in that boat. But I also kind of want to raise up the bias piece and the racism that we do see in discipline as one of the things that I worry about. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the fact that we may not have hard outcomes data right now for children just yet on 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. But to Chantel's point, there's a lot that we know about the holistic view that our children exist within families. They exist within families who have experienced hunger at higher rates in our communities, especially in communities of color. We know that homelessness, they've experienced it at higher rates. We know that they have lost family members and parents at higher rates. One specific point that I wanted to make is we have Black children as 14% of the pediatric population, but they have lost parents at 20%. There are 20% of the children that have lost parents. And so when we think about the hard data that we have that can give us an indication of learning loss, we know when we look at children holistically that their learning is affected when they're hungry. Their learning is affected when their families are facing homelessness. Their learning is affected by losing a parent. And so what can we do, not only looking at the classroom and what we need to do within the classroom, but also what supports our educators need. Again, to Chantel's point, what supports do our educators need to ensure that they're able to be responsive to children who have faced not just social isolation due to the pandemic, but extreme circumstances that have included hunger, that have included homelessness.
Awesome.
Let me.
Go ahead, Dr. Gavan, and then we'll turn over to.
So awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Chantel and Seema Ray. And just to speak to a couple of points that were already made, some of the things that I worry about us coming out of this pandemic, right? And going back to the old normal. And what I mean by that is this entire time we have a tendency to look at things through a deficit lens, a deficit-based model, right? I worry that we're forgetting to look at families through a strength-based lens. I worry that we are forgetting to talk about and lift up the protective factors that our communities have. And I'm speaking particularly to Black and Indigenous people of color, Black and brown folks, the protective factors that our families and our communities have and have actually leaned in on during this time. I worry about us securing dollars based on the trauma that was just described through Seema Ray's and Chantel's comments that our children and our families and our communities experience, and securing these dollars. And then we come out of this pandemic, we all of a sudden forget that actually happened, and we go back to the old normal so that we forget to bring those parents that survived this, those early childhood providers who fought tooth and nail to keep their doors open, our family, friends, and neighbor care that stepped in to fill in the gaps, that we forget to bring those people to the table and say, how do we spend these dollars now? Where do we put these dollars to make sure that our children and our families and our communities are thriving? Those are just some of the things that I worry about, that we forget to actually call out the fact that COVID didn't cause all of these issues. A lot of these issues had already been, they existed. And because of the way that our society is built up, what it's built on, these issues actually have been present the entire time. So I worry that we come out of this pandemic and we push all these things that we've learned, all of these narratives that we've collected, all these stories and experiences that we've been able to put in this bucket, and we take it and stick it on the shelf. and we go back to the old normal. That's what I worry about most.
And Ralph, you were about to say something, and then we accidentally hit mute on you when we were trying to hit mute on somebody else, literally silencing you. We are so sorry. So go ahead, take it away.
No, let me tell you, it's not going to be the first time that somebody's hitting me. I really appreciate 3 comments, and I want to offer up 2 responses. One, and I'll ask Rena to lend an assist in posting a section from a video that I shared. And this session we did with Ed Week, the campaign did with Ed Week, really drew on the data from both NWEA and Curriculum Associates, where because they're already in schools and because they've got tools around, not just surveys, they provide pretty reliable data. And the data, I think, are pretty unanimous that there's a real problem and challenge. And we asked them to go one step further, and that is to tell us what the implications are for schools in the near future, and especially in the coming fall. And Chantel, your point really got underscored, that when you look at the classroom, and again, because the experiences were so varied, it's hard to say anything definitive. But for those schools, in September, it's going to be a startup. Those classrooms are going to be more academically diverse. Right now, thinking about the K-3 classroom, they'll be more academically diverse than anything teachers have seen in more than a decade, because they're going to have kids in 1st and 2nd grade who have no kindergarten, who didn't have a full year head start, didn't have pre-K, and had disrupted childcare. They're going to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 or more years behind. And the foundational skills that would have been strengthened during Head Start and kindergarten, that didn't happen. And they're going to be in classrooms with teachers who may not know exactly what to do with a kid that's in a classroom and that's developmentally behind, not through any fault of their own. And so what we did is we reached out to early childhood educators. We reached out to Educare and a whole series of organizations and asked them whether they would stand by to be helpful to K-3 teachers. And the response was immediate and unanimous, and we've got a report coming out that they think that early childhood educators, for the reasons that Chantel outlined, that early childhood educators share the concern that teachers, with or without bias, just because of their lack of understanding of child development, may end up classifying behaviors as disciplinary problems. And what we all fear is that once it becomes a discipline problem, the disparate impact on low income and children of color is not far behind. And there are a number of us who are concerned that at the end of this year, we're going to see the early suspension and expulsion rates moving back to where they were several years ago. So one of the things that, in terms of how philanthropy can meet the moment, is try to figure out how we get the tools and the skills and the reservoir of expertise that are in the early childhood space to be made available to support classrooms and teachers that are in the K-3 space. Because these organizations are concerned that they can provide the supply, but they're not sure that there's going to be a demand because of the status differentiation that K-12 teachers often don't think that early childhood educators have anything to add and are people from whom they have anything to learn. And so they're saying, we're ready to go. We're ready to be helpful. We're ready to be supportive, but we're not sure they're going to want our support, even if they need it.
Rosemary, there's a lot to dig in there. I mean, you know, preparing teachers is one of your jobs. You have several jobs, so but you pick up on any of that you find compelling. But
absolutely, all of it, basically. One of the things that we have been doing, that I've been doing this last semester, is attempting to shift the paradigm, shift the thinking from learning loss to learning gains. And it really goes into what Dr. Hunt was talking about. Here in early childhood, we always say that parents, families are the first, best, and most consistent teacher of their children. And our children have been with their families, with their parents. And if we really, truly believe that they're the best teacher, the most consistent teacher, and we're so worried about how they're going to come back, what are we saying about their current environment? So we have to shift our thinking, because what we're saying, and when we talk about implicit bias, is that because we've not had control over their bodies, that somehow they're not learning. And we know that children learn from whatever environment they're in. Learning is taking place. Perhaps we need to shift our thinking to find out what was learned that we're not measuring. What gains have been made? When you talk to families, they are giving you wonderful anecdotal stories about what's happening with their children. Their independence, their resilience, their ability to get up in the morning, get themselves dressed. A lot of the children never know how to log onto the computer to get their breakfast, to take care of their own needs. Families are really tapping into what their children's needs are. I talked to a woman with a child with anxiety, second grader, and she said she could pick up on the triggers and go in and help her child disengage and re-engage. And you'd be surprised to hear that families are afraid of what's going to happen to their children when they go there, for all the reasons that my esteemed colleagues talked about. So many times teachers are preparing for the worst, rather than taking advantage of this time that we've had this year. We've been praying for family engagement. It has been at an all-time high. What are we going to do with it? Are we going to work with families to say, tell me how you've encouraged your child over the past year? Tell me what inspires your child. Tell me the strategies that you use. Tell me what makes your child really want to get engaged. And when they're not, how do you re-engage? If we do what we've been taught in early childhood all these years and honor the families as the first and best teacher, we can shift all of this. That's not to say that when they go into classrooms, teachers who themselves have been overwhelmed, teachers who themselves have gone through the trauma of COVID and civil unrest and racism and job loss and all of that, that we won't see some of the things that we've talked about. But at MSU Denver, we are just trying to shift that paradigm so that they're not expecting the worst, but really working with families to prepare for the best. And once we have that foundation, through that positive lens, that we're acknowledging the protective factors that Dr. Hunt talked about, that we are acknowledging those, that the cultural foundations of wealth, you know, the aspirational capital, the familial capital, the oppositional capital, all of those forms of capital that Dr. Yoso talks about, and we can see the strengths that those children are coming in with, perhaps we can minimize some of the negative impacts, or what would I say? Some of the negative expectations that children that teachers are having. So, because you see what you expect, and that there are times you create it. So, what my goal and what we're trying to do with incoming teachers is to change the expectation.
And
I think that is something to take forward. Yeah, Steve Marie, I was going to go, because you guys have been talking to parents and doing parenting sessions and events all through, I mean, historically and in the last year, right? Y'all want to say what you're hearing too?
Yeah, I'll just set the stage for Dr. Hunt to jump in, because she's been working closely with families, but just to say that as I think everyone on this panel has mentioned that we need to be speaking with parents, we need to be speaking with caregivers and out of the community. And Dr. Hunt will go into this more, but when we're talking about parents, that we need to talk about uncles, we need to talk about aunts, we need to talk about grandparents, we need to talk about, for those 20% of Black children who have lost a parent during the pandemic, who are those folks who have stepped in? Who are those family members, those family friends and neighbors who have stepped in to support that child? And how do we have them a part of this conversation as well? So I just want to make sure we have an expanded view when we're thinking about those parents, that we'll have to be very cognizant now of expanding our view because of the children who have, first of all, this isn't new to the pandemic, as Dr. Hunt already said, that the community taking a part in raising children is a part of all of our communities, was before the pandemic, and will be important as we're moving forward as well.
Tavonia, I think you wanted to add what y'all are hearing from families in North Carolina.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the beautiful things, and somebody already mentioned how family engagement is at an all-time high right now, because our community, many folks in our communities don't have the opportunity to telework. So they're at home, they're either out in the communities working, or they're sending their children to friends, family, and neighbor care. And so a part of the conversations that we're having with families out on the ground, in parking lots, in school building parking lots, and grocery store parking lots, is the fact that they want what's best for their children. They may not be able to control how quickly we come out of this pandemic. They might not be able to control whether or not their supervisor allows them to telework. They might not be able to control how much pressure they're getting to get their rent paid or bills paid through this whole situation, but they can control how much time they spend reading with their children, having conversations with their children. And so they understand that these things are important and they want what's best for their children. What they're asking for is support on how to deliver these things they know their children need. How do we support grandma who's at home taking care of my child while I'm having to go in because I'm a frontline worker? These are the things that our families are asking for. And I completely 100% agree. Our parents are the experts in their children. They are the experts in their children, and we keep tossing around language like culturally relevant pedagogy when we're discussing education in these spaces, and we're forgetting the fact that that includes family, friends, and neighbor care. It includes a transformative vision of how we talk about childcare, what we deem as appropriate or inappropriate, and how we meet people where they are. Our families just want to be met where they are. They're thirsty. They know their children need, they want for their children. They need support. They're asking for support on how to deliver these instructions or deliver these activities or find the resources they need in order to support their children while they're at home. They want to do it.
Can you share about some of the ways that you are meeting families where they are through book distributions and through helping tutor grandparents? Just a couple of examples.
Sure, absolutely. So some of the things that we've done here in Charlotte is actually set up shop, like I said, in front of grocery stores. We partner with our local grocers and we distribute culturally relevant books. So we distribute learning kits, or what we call literacy kits. We teach families how to use a tool called the Reading Checkup so that they can support their child's literacy growth at home. We've demonstrated how to use these activities. We talk with our guidance counselors in some of the schools, our early ed providers, and ask them, what are some ways that we can show up for your families, because you know your family's best. And if they say, come and put a table in front of our parking lot or in our driveway, that's what we do. That's exactly what we do. We've had virtual sessions with families through our NBCDI's Family Empowerment Program, and have the opportunity to have discussions with our parents about everything from child rearing, right? How to support your child emotionally and socially while at home, how to support literacy and numeracy growth, all of these different things. How to use your time in the kitchen to grow your child in several different areas. And they're thirsty for it because they're asking these questions. How do I support? I want to be able to do this. If you give me the tools, something that's relevant to my family, that's relevant to my children, and that's easy to understand, that's easy to deliver, I will do it. Just tell me what to do or how to do it. And so those are just a few examples of how we've been able to meet families where they are. at the very height of the pandemic, we conducted what we call front porch visits. So that's what we actually go on foot. We have a literacy facilitator that went on foot and sat in the driveway with picture books, and grandma was at the door with the mask on and sitting in the driveway reading a book, demonstrating how to do active reading, how to ask questions, how to grow vocabulary right there in the driveway. We call those front porch visits. And those are the types of things that our folks appreciated and they asked for more of.
Thank you. And one thing I want to talk about before we get any further is when we talk about what children learned during the pandemic, while they were with their families, it makes me think about home language, Chantel, and the fact that it was, another year for folks to be maybe more time spent together, right? Developing your skills in your home language. It doesn't mean that you weren't developing language and pre-reading skills. And, dual language learners is a big area of expertise for you. So I'm wondering if you would want to say a little bit about that group and how people should be thinking about that. I'd hate to see kids labeled as having some kind of special need when in fact, they've been developing their home language all this time and we just don't know how to assess right.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points. And when I think about what kids have gained, that is like one of the things very top of mind, a very concrete thing, right? Like one of our big goals at the CEP is advancing dual language immersion opportunities and bilingual learning for kids. And we just got a year and a half of, of language immersion for a lot of DLLs, right? And for a lot of these kiddos who so often they are in childcare or pre-K or preschool programs where the instruction is exclusively in English. And we see the pattern that over time, they lose the home language or it greatly weakens, right? And that has a whole bunch of effects across the board. There's research that finds that DLLs who keep their home language and become kind of balanced biliterate is what they're called, compared to DLLs who end up losing or weakening kind of their home language over time. They are more likely to go to a 4-year university. They actually have greater earnings in adulthood. And so there are these kind of really tangible outcomes from really strengthening that language base. I have a 2-year-old who is like right at the peak of that language explosion, where he's like saying new words and new phrases and he's like joking now. But he's bilingual and he understands both, but his verbal expression is primarily in Spanish. And I can just imagine if I sent him at this point, right, to childcare, to pre-K, where the provider did not speak Spanish, there would be hundreds of missed language and social opportunities throughout that day, because they would probably understand 20% of what he's saying when he happens to pair it with a gesture. Versus at home, I understand like 90% of what he's saying because he's still developing language, and I can use all of those opportunities to expand his language, to make it a social learning opportunity, to expand his vocabulary. And the difference between that 95% and that like 25% makes a real difference when you're right in that really early childhood space when your language development is so important. So it's not surprising then that we see these effects later on, right, in college and in earnings. So yeah, that is one of the things that is very front of mind. We also have to kind of consider the fact that Latinos and a lot of families of DLs and Latino DLs are more likely to be frontline workers. But they're also more likely to live in intergenerational households where there are other people like grandma or like auntie or uncle or tia and tío who can also play in that role. My grandmother taught me to read in Spanish before I learned to read in English. So, I think there are lots of opportunities, and the language piece is just a really clear-cut place where there have hopefully been gains. I don't know, the data, we certainly don't collect enough data of DLs even in pre-K. We certainly probably haven't collected it at home, but it's one of my hopes, I guess, in going back. And when we think of our systems and funders and others who are influential in determining what these programs look like when we come back and building back, I hope that is one of the things that we can bring with us and continue to push and expand that immersion that they've had at home and make it a reality in schools and in early childhood programs.
Well, I think one thing that y'all have talked about, and I'm watching the chat, so feel free to put questions in, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself. But so funders, I want to try to get to application here a little bit because some ideas have come up. But you know, some of our funders at all different levels do partner on a bunch of things y'all talked about. But one is assessment. Like I know people fund kindergarten entry assessments with their state sometimes, you know, they complement what they might have done through grants from US Department of Education or from the State Department of Education. And it seems to me that this is going to be one of the places that the rubber meets the road, is what y'all are talking about in terms of like, will we be able to even recognize what has been learned? But we do want to know where we want to meet kids where they are with their reading skills. Like, what would you advise people if they're talking to their school officials, if they're being asked to fund things regarding assessment? Like, what should they be asking? What should they be thinking about to do it right?
I know there's a report coming out from the Gates Foundation about assessments and how to ensure that we are cognizant of racial equity when we're developing assessments. And the conversation I was having with them was around assessments that are solely a stranger to a child, a 3, 4, 5-year-old, assessing their knowledge are ineffective. That assessments should include assessments from educators who are very close to a child, caretakers that are close to a child, and family members who are close to children. That we should ensure that we're not measuring how well the 3-year-old engages a stranger, we're measuring their learning, we're measuring their growth. So the assessments where we have family members and educators who know children and can assess whether or not 3-year-olds don't feel like telling strangers their ABCs or their colors sometimes. And so we have to ensure that we have trained assessors, or again, assessors who know children who can properly assess what they have learned. With that, then we also are able to pull in the knowledge of the family and the knowledge that educators have of the children and families that they serve into that assessment process. And so what children have learned at home, what children have learned during the pandemic, I believe will have less of a chance of it being lost the more we focus on assessments that pull in the assessment of families and that pull in the assessment of educators.
So just a couple of quick things, and I saw Barbara's note in the chat, which is a point, an important point. I was gonna say, with respect to DLLs and the language piece that we were just talking about, an assessment that we're talking about now, assess in the home language for sure, especially now when possible. And there's certainly a whole lot of languages for which we don't have valid and reliable assessment tools. But we should be some of the way there in Spanish, at least. And so there are some languages in some areas for which we don't have an excuse not to use them. And there are others where there is clear need, maybe for funders, right, to begin to validate, and in particular communities where there is a prevalent language where we don't have tools to invest in that space. The other thing I'd say, as I alluded to earlier, like we don't count DLLs nationally as a matter of policy. And so some states in their pre-K programs count DLLs, many don't, and many of the ones that have many DLLs don't. And so now instituting something like a home language survey kind of across the board to better understand that background and how we support kids, you know, there's an opportunity to do that now. And the third thing I'll say, and like hopefully hand it to Rosemarie, is I feel like she kind of listed off a home learning gains assessment in her response earlier on with like 10 different indicators that we should be asking and standardizing across the board.
Absolutely. And just, I think Seema Ray and Chantel framed it beautifully, but as we're looking at assessments, we have to be able to look at assessments based on what children have gained and learned from home. And in some ways, it'll be some of the same things that we look at in terms of language and self-help skills and social emotional growth, but being able to really look at how that's viewed, how that's measured, what assessments look like. And as Seema Ray said, who's actually conducting the assessments, going to be very, very important.
Ralph, do you have anything that you want to add on this point? If not, I'm going to pivot over and ask you to talk a little bit about workforce. But go ahead.
What I was thinking about, and I'm really listening and learning a lot about the early years, because as you know, our work is mostly in the early grades. But this seems to be, from a standpoint of how funders can meet the moment, this seems to be a really good time to rethink. And if I'm not big on this whole rethink, reimagine, reinvent chorus, I'm not part of that chorus, except when it comes to kindergarten. And kindergarten and the expectations and the organizations of kindergarten has so much influence in terms of what happens in the early years. I would think that funders, and I know some already are, should look really closely at what the kindergarten should look like as we go forward. And I know some folks are saying that maybe the whole kindergarten readiness assessment should be transformed, and maybe kindergarten ought to be seen as a transition year where the entire year is about an assessment within the context of building a relationship with the child and with the family. There's some really intriguing proposals around, and that's what comes to mind. And I think that a kindergarten may be a real opportunity for the early childhood field to exercise maximum influence on the K-12. And as kindergarten is in flux this year, a lot of folks redshirted their kids. We don't know how many people are actually coming into kindergarten, how many are going straight to first grade. That's a place of perhaps maximum uncertainty. And so it may be the optimal moment to make a stand and say, we can do this different, and this should be driven more by folks in the early childhood field than what we normally think about as a K-12 field.
Shanera, I see you came off. You turned on your camera. Did you want to? Oh, I want to see if you wanted to address this point and put in the chat because I think it gets to what Ralph had mentioned earlier about his paper coming out about these links. Do you have an idea about that you want to share?
I don't. Just adding again, just bridging that gap between the early.
Uh-oh. Somehow you got muted, but I don't think we did it.
Excuse me. Did it happen? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And just being able to bridge that gap just between the two, and that just stemmed from speaking off of what he was mentioning with his as well, and having, like I said, that mentorship, and it being able to coach each other through, because they both go hand in hand, and being able to catapult children to have them where they need to be prior to going to kindergarten or when they enter kindergarten. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to get some more of the audience in here, and y'all haven't been posting questions. I wonder if there are projects that you're involved in as funders, whether they be about teacher preparation for welcoming kids back, or whether they be about addressing the mental health. I mean, there were a lot of topics that came up here. Does anybody have something they're working on that they want to share with their colleagues so we could share some of our best ideas?
And forgive me, Don Hickman from Central Minnesota, and I'm joining quite late, so I may make nonsensical contributions to the conversation, but we did get over a 3-year period about $600,000 from our state Department of Education for summer programming, very wide definition of what that can include, distance learning at the peak of the pandemic, training related to COVID, whether that's self-care for providers or how to talk to kids about COVID or family stress, and safety enhancements when early childhood educators just couldn't get sanitizer or equipment that could be easily cleaned, et cetera. And the priority always was vulnerable kids, ESL, minority, low income, so rural as to not have other resources or special needs. And boy, they're generally small grants, but they've been deeply fulfilling to award. People are awfully grateful.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate that.
Shannon, if I may,
Yeah.
as we're thinking about funding and need, we know that there's a lot of funding going into early childhood mental health consultation. I want to encourage funders to really think about the program through an equity lens. We have research that shows that when the child, teacher, and consultant are the same race and share the same language, the outcomes are go through the roof. But we also know that the early childhood mental health consultation workforce mirrors that of the teacher workforce, where the majority of consultants are white. And we really need to think about funding for people of color, for the BIPOC community, and those who speak the languages of the children that are being served, if we want the outcomes that we hope for, especially when you think about implicit and explicit bias and how no program, I don't care how evidence-based it is, if it's implemented through a biased lens, we're not going to get to where we want to go.
I appreciate that.
Shannon, I put one more idea on the table. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Karen Mapp's dual capacity framework. But I think the earlier comments make a powerful case for investing in using the dual capacity framework as a bridge. While the dual capacity framework is generally seen as a kind of a K-12 or even later tool, it probably is really important to take advantage of the fact that a lot of parents and teachers today have a better understanding of the other's role and why it is that neither one can do the job alone. And what Karen Mapp's dual capacity framework has done is it provides sort of the guidelines and mileposts for the training and support and coaching and development, which allows for that relationship between the significant adults in the lives of the child, acknowledging the parent as the expert on the child, the teacher and the expert as the expert on the classroom, and figuring out how they can essentially blend and braid the different expertise they bring into a more powerful set of supports for the kid. It's really worth paying some attention to, and I think it's really worth investing in at this point as we make this transition.
Sorry, I muted myself because kids were coming in from school in the background. I know Karen, but I don't know about that. So we will look that up and we will definitely send that out. And that was one of the follow-ups I was, going to ask too, which is y'all alluded at the beginning to the family engagement being greater than any point in the past. So Ralph, you've given us one way of trying to think about how we'll capitalize on the new understanding between parents and teachers and ramped up family engagement. Do other people have ideas? We have a lot of family engagement funders, people who fund those projects on the line.
I think I just be remiss if I didn't point out Head Start models and the fact that we have this comprehensive model that's scaled across the country that has always kind of prioritized parents and family engagement and has had this holistic view of children and families and connects to job training if you need it, connects to housing support if you need it, sends you to the food pantry if you need it, and serves as kind of community support. When we talk about all of these challenges that have been exacerbated during COVID, Head Start's been doing a lot of that and was designed to be doing a lot of that. And so in thinking how we make more Head Start-like experiences in the rest of the early care and education field, or make it holistic or however we want to call it. And I think that, right, kids don't stop needing that when they transition into kindergarten, and families don't stop needing that. And it's not, so I think also looking at the transition between a Head Start like experience or holistic experience in early childhood, and then how we do that and replicate that in the K-12 space through maybe community schools, maybe different models. But there are models that have been developed for this type of thing, and it really feels like the moment to look at those more carefully, and to look at that trajectory of holistic supports and what we have in the early ed space. And Head Start is a lot of what we have in the early ed space that follows that model, and how we connect that then to continuing supports once we get that transition to kindergarten.
Yeah, that reminds me of a couple of things. I mean, on the early childhood side, I see a +1 to full service community schools. On the early childhood side, I was just talking earlier today with the National Indian Child Care Association. And if folks are regular ECFCers, you know that I never want to stop talking about tribal early childhood and an indigenous early childhood. And I'm hoping they're writing a concept paper that I can share with anyone who wants it. But one of the things they're going to be working on for tribes got a lot of money too. And I said, what are you working on? They were like, well, one of the things we're working on is a family support toolkit, so that tribal childcare programs can start to use some lessons from Head Start and use some of the ramped up money that's come in from the rescue plan to put more family support into their existing early childhood programs, but they'll need some technical assistance to do that. So and the other thing that made me think about in K-12, Chantel, which is another great place for people to think about investment, is in the Family Resource Center model, which I'm part of a philanthropic collaboration with us and Casey Family Programs around how we're going to bridge prevention, child welfare, and family resource centers have come up a lot. And I know we have at least one Kentuckian on the line, Tony Payton from Louisville, and in Kentucky, they have family resource centers at most schools, I believe, and all. So it's a school-based model. Anybody else? I know that anybody else want to talk about family engagement and what y'all are thinking about?
So I'm going to add that, of course, we're super huge on family engagement because we know that it works, right? There's a resource that that can be funded much, much stronger than it's funded, and that's our early educators, right? So I'm talking about those private providers who are not a part of the Head Start model. I'm talking about family child care homes again. I'm talking about the smaller child care centers, and that could be paid more. They can be such valuable tools in helping to bridge the gap or help families transition from early education into the K-12 space. If we make sure that we pour dollars into their professional development, into their salaries, so that they have living wages, comparable wages, that they're paid well, that they have the opportunity to take care of their own mental health, and that they're able to come to these spaces prepared and equipped to be able to meet families where they are when they cross the threshold, when they come into their classrooms. They have so much space because our families trust their providers. They have so much space and so much time and so much opportunity to help answer questions for families, provide toolkits and resources for families so that they're better equipped to enter the K-12 space and continue their family engagement, their involvement and their engagement in their child's academic experience once they enter the formal academic space. And we just need to pay them. We need to pay them. We need to pay them. We need to pay them. And we need to be very intentional about what we're asking of them when we're talking about professional development, and stop assuming that just because they are in the early ed space that they come equipped or they've been through a program that's taught them how to engage with families, how to meet families where they are. That's something that I think we take for granted. And we just need to pay them, y'all. Just pay them.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. Go ahead, Val.
No, I say count me as part of the pay them crowd. You know, I think I think that message ought to be repeated. We ought to pay them for their value and their worth and their work, that we ought to do that. Let me just offer up Playful Learning Landscapes, Too Small to Fail, and the entire effort to mobilize communities, whether it's the laundromats, the playgrounds, the grocery stores, the bus stops, create communities that are language and literacy rich, so that parents have a surround sound that no matter where they go, they are supported by informal places and spaces in the community that reinforce powerful messages about literacy and about learning. And there's some wonderful examples across the country, and we ought to invest to make those examples ubiquitous. So that's another idea for funders who are thinking about investing in terms of long-term change.
Barbara, I'd like to invite you to come off of mute and share your question from the chat, if you don't mind.
It's great to see all of you. One of the things that we've been sort of fretting about, I would say, is the fact that so many kindergarten and they don't really have great pre-K statistics, but I believe many pre-K many parents took their kids out of kindergarten and pre-K. So there's kind of this wide variety of experiences. Some could be very rich, some could, but they just are probably, there's gonna be a pretty big divergence. And we're hearing that a lot of districts are planning on just making age level decisions. So if you were 6, you'll go into first grade, whatever experience you might have had before that. And that has a lot of, I think that has a lot of good aspects to it and has a lot of challenges as well. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think from an equity perspective is really the best kind of policy around how to handle this unique circumstance?
Can just list a few things off the top of my head when I read your question. I think one thing that comes to mind that obviously everyone's talking about now is summer and how we could use ARP dollars to really optimize summer and summer learning, whether that's at home with your family, if that's at a center-based program transitioning in, if that's ideally a combination of both, like how we do that. I think it's going to be a really individualized decision too, that we should work with families to figure out where families think kids should be and not make it a strict cutoff. I think, to the point earlier, assess kids accurately, especially kids who speak more than one language. And I think the other thing that comes to mind is just getting a lot better and being more at scale on individualization in the classroom. I think we have, when I think about individualization, the first place that I go is inclusion specialists for kids with disabilities and how we're successful in including kids with, different ability levels within the same classroom. And there's lots of models that field has implemented that we could learn from. There's co-teaching models, there's different push-in and paraprofessional models, there's just a variety of things. There's inclusion coaches that specialize on individualization in learning that I think we can learn from and apply a little bit more broadly to this kind of newer uneven landscape maybe that we're going into. So just a few thoughts.
Rosemary, yeah, I figured you might want to add from the perspective of a teacher trainer.
Absolutely. And what we found here in Colorado, and it's probably true across the country, only 40% of eligible children are served in Colorado's preschool program. So 60% of children are not. So having children at different levels entering into a preschool program or even into kindergarten is not really new. That teachers have had to have individualized and differential instruction forever. We know that may have increased, it may seem more exacerbated at this time, but I think preparing teachers, as Dr. Devanya continues to say, to meet children where they are is going to be the most important thing that we can do in order to close whatever gaps there are. I mean, just like Colorado, and I'm sure all across the country, more affluent parents have had their children in learning pods and with other types of experiences. that may have increased their academic growth and development. So preparing teachers to understand where children are and not see them from that deficit lens, to recognize the strengths that they bring with them and be prepared to handle a wide range of developmental stages when they go into the classroom. It's going to be important.
One last question. I see that Rashonda, I don't want to lose your question, which you put, and you're off camera. So may mean that you're not in a position to ask it. So I'll ask it. Rashonda was asking about specific programs to help children and families deal with loss and death. I mean, I think people have had a lot of loss. Parents, grandparents, uncles, community members, religious leaders. Do you have ideas about things funders should be doing to support that?
I can't speak to specific programs, but I would say again that hearing from families, asking questions from a strength-based perspective about what they've been able to do, what they've been able, what our communities have been able to do, how they've shown resilience, I would say is the right way to start the assessment process. There's so much that, so many ways that so many people have stepped in for children, as you said, who have lost a plethora of different family members, and then hearing not only directly from families, but also hearing directly from those who work most closely with families. Again, as we said, family, friend, and neighbor care, those who are providing, those leaders who are supporting families, and then our educators who have been there to help children process and work through these processes. I think those are the folks who are going to be the most important to hear from in identifying the best ways to support children right now.
And I think the first thing that I think of when I hear about loss is the coping and the possible depression and you know the mental health challenges that might come with surviving family members. And so kind of going back to that Head Start model of centering family wellness and community connections and ensuring that families and teachers have the connections and screenings when appropriate to get the mental health supports that they need. I think it's another thing to think about.
You know, and philanthropy could look for a bridging moment or bridging opportunity here. You know, military families have really had to cope with this challenge, certainly not of the scale in such a short period of time, but they've got mechanisms, and it might be worthwhile to reach out and invite them into the conversation. And in inviting them into the conversation, we create another opportunity for populations that sometimes don't overlap often enough to come together around a shared experience and not about their differences. And that's something I think in this moment could be a really worthwhile undertaking for philanthropy.
If I could just add one more thing, I just like.
Yeah, we're at time.
Okay, so many times we talk about trauma-informed practices. I do want us to think about culturally responsive, healing-centered practices that appeal more to the BIPOC community, and it's a more collective healing process than individual.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I actually want to learn more about that, so it'll be good to follow up with you about that. Well, I hope everybody will take a minute and maybe pop an emoji or something up at your screen to thank this panel. I mean, really, the amount of expertise and knowledge and wisdom is just astounding that we have. So I appreciate that so much.